Hello everyone and welcome. This is David Bianco. If it's your first time here, thanks for joining. Today on our Safe and Sound Texas audio excursion, we're going to be doing a vinyl shootout of Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young's classic LP, Deja Vu. I've got the original George Piros cut, which was released when the album was released in 1970, and I've got the Mobile Fidelity or MOFI half-speed master from 1983. So, this is a classic album. Neil Young joined Crosby, Stills, and Nash, and it certainly added a new dimension to the music from their previous release. This album was recorded in 1969 from July of 69 through January of 70, and it was released on March 11th, 1970. And it was released in the U.S. on Atlantic Records, and it was given the catalog number SD 7200. So having one of those nice round numbers tells me it was slotted for release in advance. And speaking of in advance, by January of 1970, 3 months before it even came out, Atlantic already had $2 million worth of pre-orders. So this was a highly anticipated album. And remember, this was before the internet age. So that information got out through press releases or through a magazine article or a newspaper article or something. So it was more like snail mail kind of communications.
Not again. Why does it say pepper jam when there is no pepper jam? I swear to God, one of these days, I just kick this piece of out the window.
You and me both, man. I think it's lucky I'm not armed.
Piece of
The LP was number one, but only for 1 week in the U.S., but it was ranked 148th of the Rolling Stone magazine's top 500 albums. So that was a great feat for it, and it was certified gold in the U.S. a mere 14 days after its release. And it spent 88 weeks on the Billboard Top 200 and had been certified 7 times platinum by the RIAA. So that's quite a track record for this album. It spawned 3 top 40 singles: Woodstock, Teach Your Children, and Our House. A 4th single, Carry On, was in the mix, but it didn't even reach the top 100, which is funny because for me, at least, that's one of my favorite tracks on the album, but so be it. So the original of this released in 1970, the Mobile Fidelity released in 1983. It was mastered by Stan Rickard, and of course, as usual on these pressings, it has very clean and quiet vinyl. We can tell you that as a baseline. The original that I have was done by George Piros, and he's no slouch in the mastering world in the day either, but that vinyl was a bit noisier than the MOFI right out of the box. So that is something I think you have to look at if you're picking up a used one of these. And I want to make the point that, visual grading and play grading are two different things. Because honestly, when I look at this record, it's pristine visually, but that doesn't mean there isn't surface noise, and there is. So when you're able to go into a record shop and they have a listening station, take advantage of it, because the visual isn't quite enough, in my opinion, because I've had records that look super clean and they're noisy, and I've had records that look like maybe they would have something that was a problem and it wasn't. So you're going to listen to the record. So if you can get a chance to actually audition it, I would advise you do that. There was also a 50th anniversary that came out in 2021. I think it was scheduled earlier, but because of COVID, I think it ended up getting delayed a bit. And it had Chris Bellman doing the remastering and the cut of lacquer on that. And that one I've heard is good, but it is not part of my shootout because I don't have that record. So what did I find in the shootout? Well, first thing I'm going to talk about is the leveling of the volume level in decibels between the two records. These two were pretty much at the same dB level, which really doesn't happen that often. So that's really good because you don't have to make adjustments and go back and forth, and it makes for an easier comparison. Now, I would say that this was very well recorded record. Listening to the OG and listening to basically it compared to the CSN record that I did a review on before, that I really had some issues with the Mobile Fidelity release that had come out in a one-step. So this one was, I think a lot of lessons were learned from what I have read in the recording process and bringing these guys together in the studio. And I think it definitely showed between those two. So well recorded. So first track, Carry On, I'll sample about 5 here. The OG, again, it was noisy right at the start. Acoustic guitar attack was very solid on the intro, and the voices very, very well balanced and present there in the OG. The MOFI in comparison brought about a precision of the lower end in percussions. You could hear contact on instruments such as the cowbell. It was almost like you could hear the body of the stick resonating after a hit, as opposed to on the OG, you kind of heard the hit on the cowbell, but it didn't have that three-dimensional kind of sound to it. So that was very impressive to me. And boy, just comparing those two right back and switching, it was rather telling difference actually. That was an area where I thought, the percussion and everything just had a little more weight to it, had a little more breadth and depth to it, and just felt, stronger. The OG was a little bit up a bit and didn't really give you that feeling. It was a little too mid-rangey and didn't really come down into the woofer enough. It would be what I would call it as far as making that comparison. Now on Teach Your Children, again, on the OG, what I felt was the acoustic guitars were above like center mid-range. They were up higher. Given they had less downward, it caused it to sound a little bright. And it also had a little bit of, the vocals had a little bit of the S on it, or the sibilance a little bit on a few of the words that were spoken during Teach Your Children. Whereas on the MOFI, you had the same condition. Acoustic guitars reached down further. Balance was better with the upper end. The voices were more precise, including, it did have the S, but it really didn't have the sibilance. So it was, that was an advantage as well. And the precision of the electric slide guitar was much more evident. You could really kind of hear the hands going on the instrument and across the strings, and get a little more feel to that actual instrument in it. So the MOFI, again, really bested the OG on this one. Helpless on the OG, again, bass and lower piano notes were not below mid-range here. They came down a bit, and but much of the sound of this song did stay more trapped in the mid-range, and this started to become a little bit of a theme. Whereas on the MOFI, the bass and the piano, they reached down lower to be felt, not just heard. And the hi-hat hits were much more evident on the MOFI than the OG. And it really, the tone of that track, Helpless, had a really rich nature to it. It felt really rich. It's not one track that I'm as familiar with or played as much, but in listening to it, it just did have a real richness that came alive in the MOFI pressing. The song Deja Vu, my comment of that is it was subdued in comparison to the MOFI. And in the MOFI, I said it has much more depth, sonics, and imaging present on the track Deja Vu. So again, opened up, a little bit more sound stage, definitely more feeling of the instruments. And again, that feeling of reaching down a little bit lower and giving the track some warmth. Our House, on the OG, the piano was not as pronounced, and the hi-hat cymbal is more muted, and the drums only come in kind of like with a mid-level punch, whereas on the MOFI, It's very clean at the start. Piano depth and hi-hat cymbal are crisp, so we get that broader dynamic range. And when the drums come in, they have a bit more depth and tonality. They hit you a little lower. And so, again, it's a matter of impact. And as I go through these, that's kind of the word that I start to want to resonate to you, is that it's more impactful of a pressing. You feel it more. And because of that, the songs, really sound richer. And the last track I looked at was Everybody I Love You. That's a funny thing at the beginning of this, and it happened on both cuts. The volume of this track seems to increase from the start, and about 5 seconds in, it just really explainably goes up. And it isn't like a fade up. It really sounded like an oh shit, excuse my French, but like somebody went, oh, I don't have this up enough. And it's across the levels. It's not one instrument or voice. It's across the board. Like somebody went, oh, and made an adjustment. It's just kind of weird. It has nothing to do with the difference between the pressings, because it was the same on both, because it's on the original 2-track tape. So on the OG, I said the vocals don't get into being as bright as they sometimes were on other things. And again, I think that was because in a lot of those tracks, because the mid-range was there and it wasn't lower, the top end was more evident because of it. You didn't have that balance going on with the dynamic range. So this one was a little more balanced in that. And on this one, actually on the MOFI, the track seemed, the vocals were a bit brighter, which was not my experience on the other tracks. And it was actually less rewarding on the MOFI, this particular track. For whatever reason, that was just how it came across. But on the core tracks that are on this album, the ones that you and I know and love, that were the most popular ones and what have you, clearly the MOFI is better. And so in summary, the overall depth, space, and richness of the MOFI really worked well with this material. It really draws out the quality of the engineering and the recording, unlike the previous Crosby, Stills, Nash LP that had poor miking and was exacerbated on the MOFI One Step, for example. So Stan Ricker did the mastering for this for MOFI. He did much of their product in the 80s when they were cutting them in Japan, a half-speed master on the JVC cutting system. So that was what this came off of, what was delivered at that time. This didn't have nearly what I would call that smiley EQ effect that sometimes people say certain MOFI releases had back then. I really didn't get that feel at all. There was a richness that was provided through this approach, and how they get there is anybody's guess sometimes, because obviously we're not sitting there and we're not in the studio and we're not doing the mastering. But I would say that the things that were done here were gentle enough to add what was needed in the areas which made the album very much a richer experience. And I think that's really, when I look at it and I say, okay, paying a premium price for a record, well, what do I want? I want to have a better sound experience. And it feels like this really drew out some of the areas where the original was lacking. And, it really, made me appreciate the recording and the album a lot more. And I really hadn't played it in a while. So it did what I would hope an album that's a premium album would do. And that is be a more satisfying sound. And for me, the other thing is bringing in a much lower noise floor, having quiet vinyl. That's a big deal to me, especially in this case where the OG had a pretty noisy vinyl experience, unfortunately. And again, that goes back to why when you're just doing a visual grading versus a play grading, you got to be careful, because you want to be able to listen to it, if at all possible, to determine how good it's going to sound, because how it looks isn't really going to matter when it's spinning at 33 1/3 RPM. So as always, thanks for watching. I'd appreciate it if you'd consider subscribing by clicking on the bell down there, and a thumbs up or like is appreciated. Comments are always welcome. If you have the pressing that was 2021, the 50th anniversary, let me know how that sounds. So for now, as always, thanks for watching. We'll catch you next time at our next Safe and Sound Texas audio excursion. Take care, everybody.